so that I can get as minimal streaking as possible. And you can do this really liberally, and you don't have to be careful here because it is colorless. So again, going with our lightest color, which is the pale jade. I'm going to start at a corner here, and you're going to want to move relatively quickly, only because this is such a large space, but always keep that wet edge moving. And this is a really good example of not wanting to outline, because by the time that you get to the other end of your piece, it will definitely be a little bit drier than at the beginning. So if you find that there is still a little bit of streaking or a little splotchiness, it's okay. It'll dry a little bit and blend itself, but you can always go back with your colorless blender and just start blending it a little bit. Just wet it down. So now that we've got our light tone, you just want to go into our dark tone, which is the Mediterranean blue, and just start here with the shadows. And right now, what we're doing is we're just trying to create a form for her. There's not going to be any crinkles or creases or anything like that, so it's important to try and keep streaking to a minimum. And go into my middle tone, which is the sky blue light. I'm going in a circular motion only to try and keep streaking to a minimum. And this is such a hard area to try and keep the streaking down. So again, we're going to use our pale jade just to blend all of this together. So I'm finding that these two are not blending as well. What I can do is I could have a step between these two. And I'm just going to use the muted turquoise between them and test it out here, how it works. And I'm finding that those blend much better than what it is on the paper already. And since the paper is still wet, it's really easy to just go back in there and just blend all this together so that it looks a little bit more natural and a little more smooth than what was happening before. The only way to keep track of what you're doing here is just to know the piece. And the way you do this is by having this preliminary drawing here, especially with the nice refined finished piece. This is not where you start playing with things. This is where you've already figured out what the problems are and you've already fixed it for yourself. So just be aware of where things lie on your paper. We're going to move back into the boots so that we can get into this further refinement of this detail right here. And this boot is going to be the same material or the same color as the rest of her legging. So again, same technique as always. Light first, then into the darks, paying attention to where it's weaving and where the shadows are going to end up. So I have in mind what kind of material I want. I want it to look more of like a latex. As far as this, it might be like a cotton knit or a stretch knit or something like that. You want it to be softer, you want it to be hazier. Whereas here where latex might shine a little bit more like a PVC, be a little bit shinier, you're gonna have a little bit more of a hard edge with your highlight, which is why I advise not to go back and double layer the first color that you put on. So I've designed her boot to be a part of this whole legging. So it's all gonna be the same color, so I could just keep the same technique that I've been doing. So since I'm in this sort of latex and the technique that I'm using here is the same as here and here, I just wanna keep in that same mindset. So I'm just gonna move through the piece with that in mind. It's really important to step back from your piece every so often to see how the whole piece is flowing. I like to either take a picture of it or scan it, because sometimes it's easier to see those mistakes or odd things that might be happening throughout the piece. Another thing that you could do is you could flip it upside down, and sometimes just seeing it in a different perspective, you'll see something that might be off. So as far as the bodysuit goes, we're finished, at least with the toning. So I'm gonna move back into the hair. Now this is where you wanna take a little bit more care. And what I'm gonna do is use this light cerulean blue, which is different from all of the blues that I've used so far. So I'm just gonna start with just a few strokes for the hair. So her hair is a little bit more ethereal. You want it to flow. Naturally, it probably would not be this light or this airy. But you really want to show that there's volume and there's a lot of lift. So what you want to make sure to do is just keep these pockets of highlight open, just so that her hair can remain shiny. But you also want there to be a little bit of a color blocking, because hair likes to clump together, and it'll look more natural if you've got a little bit of these dark strands coming through. And don't be afraid to use the broader tip. You don't have to use just the fine line, because we want a little bit more of a shadow back here. And then of course, if you want to just blend it a little bit, you can use the tone that you used before, which was the Cold Stone. You can just go right in there and also give it a little bit more depth. So we've got that done. I'm just gonna give it a little bit of time to dry and just move over to her boot for now. Now for her heel, I want it to look a little maybe plexiglass looking or an acrylic, something a little bit more solid and substantial than the rest of her garment. This is gonna work a little bit different. What you wanna do is keep a white highlight in there and just have little streaks, because this is a little bit more substantial, and you don't have to worry too much about streaking, because here it'll actually be to your advantage. Again, you're going back to the dark tone, going back to where I think there might be some shadows. You don't have to have it connect all the way from the bottom of the heel to the top of her heel. Here you can have a little bit more separation, play around with it a little bit. And going back with our mid-tone, maybe connecting a few of these, but never really going over that first white highlight. We want to keep that white just to give it that illusion that this might be glass or acrylic or something sturdier. So for her wings, I picked out something really light, something like the brick white. I didn't want them to be very heavy. Kind of like maybe they didn't exist, but they did. Now right now, I'm just gonna take my kneaded eraser and erase the reference lines just a little bit. Just enough so I can see them, but where they're light enough, where they won't be too substantial. What you wanna do when you're erasing is just go in one direction, not go like this, because a lot of the times, sometimes you might end up wrinkling the paper, and that's not very attractive. You're not gonna color in the whole thing. So you just want to put it in places where you might get a little bit of a shadow and still define these feathers as being, well, feathery. This you can be a little loose with. Kind of like hair, you want it to be a little bit random. You don't need to be too conscious or too careful about what's happening here. So again, while you're doing this, you want to make sure that all of your shadowing is consistent. So I don't really have a plan while I'm trying to make this look organic, but I do have in mind at least that this side has to stay light. Because if you put any shadows over here, it's going to be inconsistent with everything that you've done already. And it won't look natural, which is what you're trying to do, is make this all look natural. Now with this secondary color, using the fine line, just add little hints of detail. Maybe a little bit where the stem would be, and little breaks in the feather. What we're gonna come back with is just a colored pencil to make it look sharper, especially for a feather which has real sharp edges. Colored pencil, especially the very thin colored pencils, are great for adding that detail. It's much better to come back in with a sharper tool. So I'm gonna use primarily blues, maybe this violet here, just so that there's an extra tonal element here. So much like how I've been using the markers, I'm gonna start with maybe the lightest color of blue that I have here. Just start with her hair. So here, we're taking care a little bit more when we're doing it with the markers.